In this video, we're going to continue to look at operations involving square roots of negative numbers. So we have a few more examples here that we want to look at and look at the difference between some of these. And if we start looking here with example D, this is still under example 4. Now, if we go to multiply 3 square root negative 5 times negative 4 square root negative 12. Now, what we've learned previously is we can't just go and start multiplying. One rule that we have is before we can multiply, we have to deal with the fact that these are negatives under the radical. You have to deal with the negative first. You have to pull that negative out. So, of course, here, this is 3. The square root of negative 5, we see that negative comes out to be an I, and we keep the 5 under that square root. Now, over here, if we look at the square root of negative 12, now, we should all agree that this is the same thing as negative 1 times 12. And you can write that as I square root 12, and that's okay. But we've got to look at 12. If that number can be simplified again, we need to go ahead and simplify that. And 12 breaks down into 4 times 3. And the reason we do 4 times 3 and not 6 times 2 is because 4 is a perfect square. So this is the same thing as negative 1 times 4 times 3. The square root of 4 comes out to be 2. The square root of the negative 1 comes out to be I. And what this actual square root of 12 is equal to is, this is negative 4, and the square root of negative 12 is actually 2i square root 3. So we want to simplify as far as we can before we do anything. So this will be negative 8i square root 3. And then multiply. Now don't confuse this with the FOIL method. This is not the FOIL method. This is one term. This is 3i square root 5, negative 8i square root 3. It's one term times one term, and all you can do is multiply the numbers on the outside together. So of course the 3 times, and that's a negative 8, is going to give me negative 24, and the I times the I gives me I squared. And then we multiply the square root times the square root, which stays a square root. 5 times 3 is 15. Of course, here we don't leave that as negative 24i squared. We know that's negative 24 times negative 1, so that turns it into a positive 24 on the outside, and the square root of 15 stays square root of 15. So again, same situations, we just have to deal with what's given to us. All right, let's go to part E. This is virtually the same exact example that we just had, but we just have different numbers. Again, here, first thing we have to do is pull out the negative. We've got the negative here, and we don't want that negative there. We've got to pull that out and make that an I. So the negative comes out to become the I, and you're left with the 7 under the radical. Now with the square root of 8, it can be simplified. And the square root of negative 8, let's go up here where we have a little bit more room. The negative 8 is the same thing as 4 times 2 times negative 1. And that's, again, breaking it down even further. You can break it down that way and see that the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of the negative 1 is I, and you're left with a 2 under the radical. So we're going to, instead of writing that as the square root of negative 8, we're going to say that's the same thing as 2i square root 2. We've got to simplify before we multiply on these. So this gives me 3i square root 7 times 2 times 2i gives me that 4i is what's on the outside of the radical times 2. Here again, we got to be careful when we multiply. You can only multiply the outside terms of the radical together, 3i and 4i. Well, 3 times 4 is 12, and I times I is I squared. And then the radical times the radical, or the square root times square root, gives me 14 under that square root. 12i squared is 12 times negative 1, so we get negative 12 square root 14 as our answer on that one when we multiply. Okay, so virtually D and E were the same thing. Now let's go to our last one down here. Let's go to example F. We have 2 plus I squared. So we have in parentheses 2 plus I squared. And then minus 3 minus I, so this is minus, and then in parentheses 3 minus I squared. So 2 plus I squared, and then we have 3 minus I squared. and there's a subtraction sign in between. Now, following our order of operations, we know that we've got to deal with this square first, and we know that that's 2 plus I times 2 plus I. Foiling that out gives us 4. Outer terms are 2i, inner terms are 2i, last terms are I squared. We get, combining our like terms, we get 4i plus, we know I squared is the same thing as negative 1, so it gives me 3 plus 4i. So we have to FOIL that out and get it all the way down as simple as we can go. So all of this side gives me 3 plus 4i. Let's go to the other part. Got 3 minus I. So we know 3 minus I squared is 3 minus I times 3 minus I. And we need to FOIL that out. So that gives me 3 times 3 is 9. Outer terms give me negative 3i. Inner terms give me negative 3i. Last terms, be careful, negative times negative is positive, and I times I is I squared. Now, combining this, we get 9 minus 6i plus a negative 1. So this whole parentheses over here gives me 8 minus 6i. Now this is where we have to be careful. We FOILed this side out, and we FOIL this one out. But look what's in between these two parentheses. There's a minus sign, which means there's technically going to be a distributive property here. So this 3 plus 4i is still in parentheses. It's all of this squared minus all of this squared. So we have to turn this into a distributive property, but you want to fully simplify before you do that. Now the first parentheses came out to be 3 minus 4i, but we have to subtract what we got over here. So minus 8 plus 6i, and combining like terms, doing our real part first, gives me negative 5 plus 4i and 6i, give me 10i, and we got to make sure that we put our answers here in our a plus bi form.